If you're coming from the Westgate Freeway, just take the Williamstown Road exit and head north along Francis Street to turn right. Stay on Francis for a couple of k's, then turn right into Hyde Street. You'll see the mobile refinery tanks on your left after you turn. Looking ahead, you'll see the Westgate Bridge right in front of you. The memorial is on your left underneath it. And now pause the tour until you get out of the car under the bridge. So Steve, we find ourselves at the Westgate Bridge Memorial, our starting point for the tour. It's on Hyde Street in Yarraville, just before it turns into Douglas Parade in Spotswood. At 2.5 kilometres, it's the bronze medalist of Australian bridges in the length contest. It carries 200,000 cars and trucks a day, linking Melbourne's east with the west and the city of Geelong. By 2011, the bridge had been widened and strengthened. There are now 5 lanes in each direction. The cost of improvement was almost twice the original cost of the bridge. Some of that was no doubt paid for by the tolls collected on the Westgate between 78 and 85. You threw your money into a bucket, then the boom would go up and the sign would say thank you. A very polite bridge. The Westgate construction was marred by Australia's worst and most dramatic industrial accident. At 11:50 on the 15th of October 1970, the 2,000-tonne span under construction between bridge piers 10 and 11 fell 50 metres directly to the bank and river, crushing workers in an amenities cabin unwisely located directly beneath it. 35 were killed and 18 were injured. Some folks in the area described the impact like an earthquake. Tell us about your recollections of the day, Steve.
1970, so I would have been about 8, second grade at Sacred Heart Primary School in Newport. It was something that occurred that just resonated within the community, not just that on that initial day, but for months afterwards, years afterwards really. You know, when the bridge came down, it really did shake this area to its core, physically and emotionally. The crash could be heard for miles around. It seemed that most people in the area knew of someone that was working on it and had a lucky escape or not. As I said, I was very young at the time, and hearing of the parish priest wading through waist-deep mud and twisted metal, reading the last rites to dying men. There was a widow at the church. We would be saying prayers for her family. It had such a lasting impression upon the whole area. I don't think we're ever quite the same after that.
Remnants from the bridge collapse have been mounted as sculptures at Monash University in the engineering area, just as a kind of a warning when you're making your engineering calculations for the building of bridges, just make damn sure you get your numbers right.
Looking over to the left, you can see the mangroves that, when they were transplanted to try to clean up that silty, sludgy backwater, a lot of effluent was dumped into the Stony Creek that drains into that backwater, finding their way into the Yarra.
Well, Steve, look, we'll definitely have another chat at our next stop, which is the Spotswood Sewerage Pumping Station. It's just a couple of minutes down the road after you turn left out of the Memorial car park onto Douglas Parade. There's a car park on the left opposite the pumping station that offers some pretty good further views of the Westgate and across the river to the docks and Melbourne skyline. You can't get into the pumping station from the Douglas Parade side. It's only accessible through Science Works behind it, which is open between 10 and 4:30 p.m. most days. If you've got a few spare hours, Science Works is an awesome visit, especially for the kids. Everything's interactive. You might want to pause the tour on your phone here. Here we are at the Spotswood Sewerage Pumping Station, built in the period between 1894 and 1915. Its £3.5 million spend, 200 million in today's dollars, provided much needed work through that time of recession in Victoria. Yes, Victoria was pushing it uphill with a full head of steam. The Victorian coffers were filled with the spoils of the gold rush, but public health and sanitation were poor to say the least. While medical science in the 1800s was only beginning to understand the spread of diseases, open sewers were the drains of the day and were thought to be relatively safe, although no doubt pretty whiffy. The old thinking was that most illnesses were airborne rather than transmitted by poor drinking water, when in fact studies were proving that life-threatening diseases like typhoid, cholera, hepatitis A and E were in fact waterborne, not to mention dysentery. It was time to close those drains. In addition to the housing and construction of the 4 original steam-powered, coal-fired pumping engines, a huge network of underground tunnels was constructed all over Melbourne. The access to these sewers was via a 25-metre deep hole directly below the pumps. This basin was blasted out of extremely hard volcanic basalt that you might know as bluestone. This was fashioned into 12 oval-shaped pump wells to support the vacuum and pressure needs of the design. The human cost of industry in the West was added to by the 6 who died in the Spotswood Yarra Sewer tunnel collapse on the 12th of April 1895, which also happened to be Good Friday. Over to you, Steve, for your thoughts on the station.
Well, that's interesting, Dave. You live in these areas and you see these edifices of engineering marvels and you don't actually really appreciate it. So my only recollection really of this area is when the film Mad Max was shot here in about 1979, that those gates you can see there actually form the Halls of Justice.
Go on. Amazing. You guys check out the place and then maybe just pause the program here for a moment. Jump back in the car and we'll talk about our next destination. For those wanting to visit Science Works and tour the pumping station, turn left onto Douglas Parade and you'll see Craig Street on your right. There is parking for Science Works near the intersection of Booker Street. Continuing the tour, you'll notice the Newport Power Station chimney stack on the left. Turn left into North Road and continue alongside Newport Park, then stop at Greenwich Reserve. Jump out of the car and walk towards the water through the Foreshore Reserve. This was the site of the Greenwich Railway. Greenwich Reserve today is a great spot to have a barbecue, play on the swings and offers stunning views across the docks to the Melbourne skyline. Who would have thought that in 1857 this location had an L-shaped pier that included a railway station? A ferry steamed Melbourne passengers to a Geelong-bound branch line, the first project of the newly formed Victorian Railways. This branch line ran from the pier up North Road, where it intersected with the Geelong line. Here a new station was built that became known as New Port, because it was in fact a new passenger port. The name Newport stuck, and the name Greenwich was lost to the archives. Come out of the Foreshore Park along the Yarra and you'll come to an area known as the Warmies. It's a great fishing spot because of the warm water discharged from the nearby power station. The Williamstown to Port Melbourne ferry used to depart near the boat ramp. The last chain-guided car ferry, built in 1931, was closed in 1979, just after the opening of the Westgate Bridge. Steve, you're young enough to remember the car ferry. Do you remember how it worked?
Well, just, Dave, just. But as I recall, it was basically a flat-top vessel with a drawbridge on either end of it. Drawbridge would sort of lower down as a ramp and cars would drive onto it. They would shuffle them around. When the cars were fully loaded, no other cars to get on, the drawbridge would come up. And then in the centre of the flat-top barge, there was a big machine, probably diesel-driven, or it might have been coal-driven back then, I can't quite recall. And it had a series of cogs in it that would pull itself along this chain that went from one side of the Yarra, on the Williamstown or Newport side, over to the other side, which is the Port Melbourne side. And there was always a queue waiting one way or another. Nevertheless, in those days, that's sort of all we had, really. It eventually got sunk at one stage. That sort of put a dent in it.
And the amount of pollution that must have come out of a coal-fired electricity power plant in those days. I mean, the sky must have been black over in the west. I mean, did you notice that as a kid?
But it was all coal-driven. People in the area would comment that you couldn't hang your washing out when the wind was blowing in a certain direction. Otherwise, you would end up with soot all over your Hills hoist and you're washing.
Jeez, that's interesting.
I know people that have worked on renovations, and they say that the soot up that had gotten under the roof, that iron...
That's just from the force of the wind would just sort of blow it in there over time.
And it was, it would be an inch thick. There was even stories, Dave, of people's ceilings collapsing. You'd be sitting there out in the middle of tea and the ceiling had collapsed in you with a whole lot of coal dust on it. Lovely, isn't it? Look, there was a great deal of conjecture when they wanted to close down the power station, of course, because the unions weren't keen on it. Trucks getting unloaded with bags of briquettes, loaded into the furnaces, largely by hand. And when the coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley that were then coming in stream...
Which, ironically, is probably where all the briquettes were coming from.
They probably were. So they thought, well, rather than drag them all the way to Williamstown or Newport, we'll just we'll cut out the middleman and...
Bring them out into Mohammed.